Thanks so much for that introduction, Colin. It was very kind, and I really enjoy working with your office. It's lovely to work with the Children's Commissioner and your staff who are using kind of every resource that they have to try and stimulate and promote conversations and enhance best practice for our kids. So I feel privileged to be working with you. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Noongar people and to recognise their enduring connection to the lands and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I also want to recognise those amazing young people who we've heard from today through the video. Kids, young people, they're so often the wisest voice in the room when we give them the chance to speak, and that's certainly what I felt today. I also, I've watched that video clip. I've had the fortune to have it before the series and to have watched it a few times now. And every time I find it just heartbreaking when I hear the young people talking about the missed opportunities and when we got the supports wrong for them. More sobering is when I look at the design of our systems and I see some of the ways in which we've designed our systems for it to actually be predictable that we're going to miss those opportunities for children and their families and that we're going to get it wrong for them. And I'd like to talk today about I'm going to talk about vulnerability in the context of child protection. I am going to talk about some of those missed opportunities and the getting it wrong, but I'm going to talk about that in order to then talk about the way forward, because while there's some sobering things that we need to face in the child protection sector, I have great hope for the future for our children. I want to preface that so I don't depress you too much. So, as Colin said, I'm the co-director of the Australian Centre for Child Protection. He's our fantastic team here with the members of the Positive Futures Research Collaboration. That's our sister centre, which is Aboriginal governed, led and majority staffed and devoted to changing the lives of Aboriginal children. We're the largest centre devoted to the study of child abuse and neglect in Australia, and our mission is improving the lives of vulnerable children. So I couldn't have been invited to speak at a series that I'm more passionate about. Because child abuse and neglect is one of the leading contributors to vulnerability. It was fantastic to hear from Andrew this morning and to hear about all children in New Zealand, and I love hearing about things that are getting better and the things that give us hope. In terms of child abuse and neglect, evidence from both the Australian Early Development Census, the AEDC, and our NAP plan testing show that poor outcomes for children increases as the level of child protection involvement increases. And without effective support, our vulnerable children often also turn into our vulnerable adults. And in fact, the burden of disease associated with child abuse and neglect is equivalent to breast cancer in women and prostate cancer in men. This is a top 10 social problem for us. And yet despite that, so for me, reducing the incidence of child abuse and neglect, that has got to be one of our top priorities as a country. And yet in this slide you see, and these are the statistics for the children, the individual children, not just the number of we see coming through the door. These are the numbers of children in notifications, the number of children in substantiations. And we see over the last three decades that despite continuing inquiries, reforms and increased investments, that number's growing. We can only conclude that we're getting something drastically wrong here. What I'm going to do today is to talk to you about some very new research findings. Sorry, I also have a vision impairment, so sometimes I'm going to look at my slide and think, is that the right one? So I'm going to talk to you about some very new findings that we've undertaken in South Australia on behalf of the government there. And these findings have really fundamentally changed some of our views about the way forward. And they've made us realise that we, the Australian Centre for Child Protection, myself, we've got it wrong before, we've given wrong advice. And as a sector, we're making some really wrong assumptions about early intervention and prevention. And that's why I'm presenting these findings today. It's probably not when I agreed to the speaker series, we hadn't even finished this research, which is how new it is. So for this program of research, we started with a statistic. Professor John Lynch, who's an epidemiologist of world standing, has brought in child protection data to his big population data sets for the first time. And what he discovered shocked him so much that he's turned his attention from health to child protection. What he found was that 1 in 4 children in South Australia are reported to child protection by age 10. Now, in terms of child protection over the last really kind of decade or so, we've looked at these rising numbers of reports to child protection and we've said, well, we think that the families who are being reported, they all need something. We're worried about them. But we had assumed that the majority didn't actually require a child protection response, that they had a level of vulnerability, and so therefore we were talking about public health approaches. I still talk about public health approaches. I'm not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But what we decided around this 1 in 4 was actually to ignore all of the assumptions we'd made previously and just go back to first principles and actually have a look at the content, not the numbers, but the content of people's reports and then the records for the children, and to look in great detail at the interventions that are being provided to children and their families. We wanted to know who was being reported, why were they being reported, what interventions were currently available, and what could we conclude about why the number of children involved in child protection was large and increasing. We also wanted to know what were our strongest opportunities for prevention, for turning that curve around, because that 1 in 4 in South Australia has been growing. We weren't 1 in 4 a decade ago. So the first, in terms of what I talk about from the Early Intervention Research Director, I'm actually going to talk about 2 quite significant programs of work. So we had 5 programs of work that we've been doing over 18 months. Simultaneously, we have literally been working around the clock with well over 20 people who've been devoted to full-time to really working on this program of research across the different research groups. So the first area I'm going to talk to is actually an area that I led, which was the desktop evaluations. So in terms of the desktop evaluations, what we wanted to know was, what was South Australia investing in child abuse prevention? And were they investing in the right things for the right people? Were we doing it well? So we actually looked at all South Australian government-funded programs that the government said they think it had a child abuse prevention objectives. And that came from across all the portfolios, so health and Treasury and education and communities, youth justice, child protection. They all sit around the table and they've all put their programs forward as part of this. And in terms of the process that we went through, for each of those programs, we wanted to look in detail at their program model, their logic, their theory of change. Our Positive Futures research team, they did cultural competence assessments for each of the programs. We then matched to the international evidence around best practice, and we made an overall assessment and a recommendation which went to a governance committee of chief executives who then had to, including Treasury, who then have to report on how they're going to respond to those recommendations to a parliamentary subcommittee. recommendation was whether or not we should continue to invest in that program as it was currently designed. So I just want to talk a little bit through what we did there. So our assessment methodology. The first area was around this program model or theory. So what we did for every program, we wanted to describe the target group. Who were the clients that this was being provided for? The activities, the what, when and how was being done in the programs, and why, the outcomes, aims and objectives. We wanted to look at where, because the other thing we were concerned about was that our programs were not necessarily placed where the need was, which I think would be something quite familiar here in WA as a challenge. And we wanted to look at who was providing the interventions, what was the workforce and how were they being supported and prepared in their role. So we did that for every program. And we also did, in terms of the program theory, what we wanted to know then, was whether that made sense. So our first check was really is it bonkers? Or does it sound okay to be doing those things for that client group, for those outcomes with that workforce? We then went on and did the evidence matching. So for that, we did a series of evidence reviews. So every one of those programs that we looked at had to be matched against the evidence for what was effective. So I had a team who ended up searching over 20,000 records of journal articles internationally in the time period to look at evaluations of similar programs. Or sometimes we couldn't get the whole program, so we were also looking at the program components, so the counselling or the parenting skills development. For each of the effective programs, we then went through and identified for them the aims and objectives, the target group, the activities, the intensity and duration, and the minimum workforce qualifications and training. And then we made a comparative assessment. Did the South Australian program components line up with what had previously been found to be effective? I tell people we did this in 18 months, they think we're crazy, because we were. Now, the first thing that we actually reported to government, we started with over 200 programs, was we did a pre-assessment of each of them. We said we wanted to be clear on what their child abuse prevention objective was. So our first finding that we reported back to the South Australian government was that about half of those programs, they were working with highly vulnerable families where there were risk factors for abuse and neglect. But in terms of what was being provided, there was no active intervention that was actually about reducing the risk for child abuse and neglect occurring. Now, I'm not saying they were bad programs. They had a lot of them, I think, I wouldn't want to see that missing. There were things like supporting early literacy for children. But they should not be counted as the child abuse prevention investment, because they weren't changing anything in the home lives of those children that was reducing the likelihood that they would be abused again today and tomorrow. So what we said to government was not don't fund them. We said go back, have a look at what portfolios they rightly align with and see if there's the need for that program there. But don't call that your child abuse prevention investment. So the first finding we had was that our investment was only half as large as we thought it was initially. In terms of the evidence matching, well, we actually made some conclusions before we even started any comparisons there. What we found in both in our service design and in the evidence was really kind of three groups, three populations that we were trying to hit in our interventions. And they had varying levels of vulnerability. So what we talked about was three groups, families who are vulnerable. So they might have one or two risks and be needing some support. There were those who were high risk for child abuse and neglect occurring, and then there were maltreating families, which was what the US literature labelled them. Now, the high risk and maltreating families, that was really interesting because we were trying to work out why it was that for some of the very, very high intensity interventions, they were saying, oh, look, it works for high risk families, but not maltreating. And we were going, what's the difference between the two? What's the difference between high risk and maltreating? And we finally worked it out. We had this kind of light bulb moment. Oh, it's a systems distinction. And it was all about how child protection saw that family that day. And that's based on an incident that's reported that day. So if the person on the other end of the line is calling about child truancy, that was seen as a family with vulnerability. If the person at the end of the line was calling about alcohol and other drug misuse, domestic violence, unmanaged mental illness, that might have fallen into the high risk or maltreating category, depending on whether or not child protection were deciding to investigate or whether they were offering family preservation services as a last resort. It wasn't the characteristics of the families that were different, it was just whether the system was paying attention to them or not. And what that made us realise was that if you're thinking about the characteristics of the families, rather than whether the system's seeing them or not, and remembering this is in the context of systems that we know are not seeing everybody, it's a meaningless distinction. We need to focus on the characteristics of families and need the same types of intervention. If you've got unmanaged mental illness, if you've got active domestic violence, if you've got active addictions, then you need a very high intensity, high quality intervention. But what was happening is that the high-risk families were being diverted or grouped with the vulnerable families, so they were getting a lower intensity intervention. In terms of families with lower levels of complexity and vulnerability, then we saw a much higher number of effective interventions. There was greater flexibility in the intervention design and the workforce that could provide that intervention. What was really incredibly consistent, though, in the evidence was the importance of a well-developed and aligned program, theory and logic. So it had to be really clear why were you doing this thing for this client group to achieve those outcomes, and that you had a well-prepared workforce. In terms of the individual program findings, I have to say it was really, really hard. I care about this sector. I care about the people who work in it. And we didn't think that we were going to find something that looked this bad. Yeah, it was shocking to us, and we were assessing not to best practice, not to what we thought was the optimal thing to do, but to a minimum standard. Was there a likelihood that this could be effective? Had it ever been effective in the past? Not was it the best? So I want to start with the first column over on your left, the program theory. What we were seeing here is that, in fact, the program models, often they couldn't answer those questions we had about who's it for, what are you doing, and why. And I think that's actually a minimum standard, that programs be able to do that. And I think it's a minimum standard for practitioners. It's not fair to send people out if you don't know the answer to that question, to knock on a family's door. It's certainly not fair for families. And one of the big areas we found, and I do not think this would be different in other states and territories based on my experience working around the country, is programs were able to describe at a high level what they were doing. And there were some really common things across all of it didn't matter what agency was funding it. The most common things that were being delivered to families where there was a direct child abuse prevention objective was assessment, case management, referral, counselling or therapeutic intervention, and some parenting skills education and parenting skills development. Some brokerage money would be available, and where there was also the opportunity for some service cooperative work with other services, collaborative work, I should say. But what sat underneath that was really underdeveloped. So programs couldn't say what kind of counselling, what models were being used. They couldn't talk about what parenting skills were being provided and what models they drew from for that. that meant they were relying entirely on their workforce to know, and it was entirely dependent on the individual. Now, some of our evidence-based models actually work off that, but their workforce is for those models that have been found to be effective, is people with a master's in social work or psychology and extensive experience. So they were making a reasonable assumption in that case that the workforce did in fact have the ability to know what to do, that would have appropriate things in their practice toolkit to sit under each of those areas of practice. What we found was that we had a very underqualified workforce. There was limited in-service training to also further develop the skills of our workforce. So the prerequisite qualifications were very low, and the further out into the regions and the country areas we got, the lower that got, and the poorer the preparation of the workforce. Again, that's not fair for the workers, and it's not fair for the families, and it's absolutely not fair for our kids. I'm going to now point you to the middle column here, and this is one of the issues that it's hard because we found here a problem that comes out of the best intentions. In a service sector where we're not getting to everyone, programs we're trying to get to the most in need. And if you look at the amber column here, this was programs which had been designed for families with one or two vulnerabilities and were being delivered to families and in some cases prioritised for families who had multiple levels of complexity, the active domestic violence, the addiction, the unmanaged mental illness. And those interventions were not going to be effective for that family. It's very unlikely that those interventions would be effective for that family. They were not designed for them. And so what we call this in research terms is program drift. So where you've drifted to a different client group. And I understand that. I understand that as a practitioner. I understand it as program providers, why you'd go, I want to help this family because otherwise they're going to get nothing. But when we looked at scale statewide across all the programs and we saw this was happening at such great levels, it leads us to a really concerning conclusion, because overwhelmingly we actually don't have an effective service system. We are not providing the right things to the right people at the right time, and we're doing what we are providing, we're doing poorly. And it leads me to make the really strong point that doing something ineffective is in fact worse than doing nothing. It's worse than doing nothing because it leads us all to assume we've actually got something for those families. We didn't know we had this problem of this magnitude in South Australia. It leads practitioners to be sent out there with a high likelihood of failure, underprepared. That burns our people out who came into this sector to make a difference. It's not fair for families. They get blamed when they fail, and they've failed predictably because we gave them the wrong thing. And it's not fair for our children who are left to accumulate more and more adversity in their childhood predictably. That's my worst telling off of the day. I will note, and I noticed one of the young people talking about this, when our colleagues in Positive Futures looked at the cultural competence assessments, they found a similar problem there. And this was a shock to the state because they thought that they'd been doing okay at this. And what we found was that while the state had, in a lot of the programs, said this was important, what they couldn't demonstrate was how they'd changed their practice to be culturally appropriate. What am I doing? I am going to race through to now talk about the case file reviews. This was led by Professor Arnie. And what we started with here was the data from the epidemiologists. They said the populations with greatest involvement with child protection, that was kind of creating the most demand on the system, were children who were reported as infants, children repeatedly re-reported, that's been chronic maltreatment, and re-reporting has been a passion of my career to highlight as an issue, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So we did a case file review on it for each of those populations. I'm going to talk to you about the first two today because the case file review around Aboriginal overrepresentation has not been released yet. So we wanted to know what were people worried about, what were the characteristics of families who were reported. We wanted to know if they fell into some groups which would help us to start breaking this down into groups where we could target intervention better. And we wanted to know what were the sliding doors moments for people old enough to remember the movie. What were those chances for change? Now, in terms of the first case file review we did this first because of the policy interest in the first 1,000 days. And we had seen a lot of the first discussions about what would be provided. They seemed to all be geared around an assumption that because the child hadn't been born yet, that risk hadn't eventuated yet. And we thought, well, it's not true for some of the unborn child kind of case conferences that we're aware of. I wonder how many it is true for. What we found really shocked us. This is the bit where I said that we had some findings that fundamentally changed our assumptions. It's here in the case file reviews that we had them. We found two really clear groups. The first and the largest were parents who had children already, and those children had already been involved with the child protection system. That's clearly not an earliest point of intervention. It is not when the problem has not yet eventuated or the risks haven't arisen. The second group was first-time parents, but they weren't first-time parents from socially supportive families who were doing well in every other way. They were first-time parents with abuse histories, many of them themselves in care. Some of them were still in care. And again, this changes. We didn't see a group who with only one or two vulnerabilities. That's the big insight. People were calling and making these unborn child concern reports, not about children and families who were kind of progressively moving up a scale of complexity and vulnerability, but who were already having very, very complex needs at the time of that first report, before the child was born. But it also tells us about prevention, because that group of first-time parents right now in our system, they're not urgent enough. They don't get on our incident-based risk assessment systems. They don't get prioritised because it's not dangerous enough today to go and knock on the door, and we wait. A quarter of these children ended up on orders before they were age 2 because we missed the window for prevention. And that's why, while it's a lot of this is it's shocking to think that the complexity is this high at the point of the unborn child concern report, the hope is that there are some really clear windows for prevention. The other thing we wondered, though, about that 65% is, did we miss the window there too? Could they have actually been the mums who were the first-time mums, but following subsequent births, had we missed the windows for that 65%? So this is a very busy slide. Don't worry about it. The point to take from this one is that we decided to look not just from the child's perspective, because we'd done that with the unborn child concerns. We'd started at the earliest point for the child and found it wasn't the earliest point for the family. So we decided what we wanted to do was go back and look from a family perspective. So in terms of repeat involvement, very high levels. 40% of children are subject to a second report within 6 months. This was just 80% of children subject to a second report within 8 years. But about 90% of families had some level of re-reporting for different matters. We have to see child abuse and neglect and children who are reported to child protection, we need to see this in the context of intergenerational trauma and intergenerational disadvantage rather than first-generation disadvantage. And those of you who have worked with families, it wasn't surprising to me the idea that we needed to think about intergenerational disadvantage. We've been talking about that. We've been talking about trying to disrupt cycles. But the scale, that was the thing that got me. I just kept thinking that there was this population of families who were being reported to child protection with a little bit of vulnerability. And that's what our systems have all been kind of geared around in terms of our early intervention and prevention efforts. Not that we're starting from a point of extreme complexity, complex trauma. Scale. So repeat reporting, it also fell into some groups. It's not surprising that it fell into the different groups. What was surprising was the scale again. Look at that bottom group there around extreme reports. 23% of families with 20 or more reports. It's 1 in 4. So and the extreme involvement families, they had more of everything. So more cases that were screened out by child protection, more cases that were screened in and the decision was, we don't have to investigate today. We might not get to it all in reality of child protection. And more of the ones that they had to go and get out there today because something serious had happened. But what is happening for these families is when someone makes the call, they might make a call about one of these children in the family, which is about non-attendance at school or untreated ear infections or something like that today. And that's not treated any differently for that child, despite the fact that it's in the context of extreme involvement. So they just go into the same kind of sausage factory of incident-based screening and triaging, and we're missing the windows for prevention. Again, there's some clear directions, though, about what we can do differently. When we looked at that, I'm going to talk through some of the characteristics of the families, but I want you to look again at the extreme involvement family. The families that went on to have extreme involvement families, they were the families with the most numbers of children, an average of 7 children. They were also the families who had one of the parents, mother or father, who were under 20 years of age during the first pregnancy. They then went on to have the multiple births and the multiple repartnering. And we missed that window with them. In terms of the parental risk factors, you'll see that as involvement increases, so do the risk factors. Although I would like you to look at the blue line, which is domestic violence. It is endemic. We cannot solve the problem of child abuse and neglect without solving the problem of family violence. It almost reaches a ceiling effect in that middle column there. It is so high. One of the things that we conclude here is that callers are not calling about, there's not a random chance that they'll call about a family. They're rightly calling the most about the families with the most number of risk factors. And similarly, they are rightly calling about the most about the families in which the children are showing the most signs of the impacts of child abuse and neglect already. And we see some of these rates here for the extreme involvement group of health conditions, physical disability, learning delay and intellectual disability, alcohol and other drug misuse, criminal behaviour, and mental health and behavioural problems. I have to say our team really struggled seeing the rates of suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts. They are such a strong indicator from our kids in child protection. Sometimes the last signal they've got left for us to please pay attention to me. I've talked about the case file data, and it was small sample, relatively, kind of moderate sample for child protection research. So we're in the hundreds. But I wanted to go back to the population data, and John Lynch, Professor John Lynch, the epidemiologist on our team, has given me this slide, and this is the Australian Early Development Census, and what this shows is our population data actually supporting the findings of the case file reviews. So this is 54,000 children, not a small sample anymore, taken from 3 of the Australian Early Development Censuses in South Australia. And the dotted red line there is the average. So that's the average for our state. The first column is children who have never had any contact with child protection, whereas the second column is children who've been reported to child protection but not even screened in. So child protection were saying, I don't think they're our business yet. Our reporters are getting it right. Our child protection system is getting it wrong. And I think that's one of the things that we have gotten so wrong. We've done so many things that it's been about trying to make reporters report better quality reporting. Let's try and sort the wheat from the chaff. Our reporters are getting it right. And further evidencing that, as you move up the continuum, and I was supposed to do these little pointers here, as you move up the continuum, you'll see a greater proportion of children, the more involvement you get with child protection, who've got one or more of those vulnerabilities on the AEDC. So the conclusions we make. Families with higher involvement with child protection have correspondingly higher levels of risk factors and adverse child outcomes. The population data is supporting the case file review data. We're concluding that our reporters are getting it right. Repeat involvement is very high and associated with poor outcomes. It's not nonsense, it's not noise, these reports to child protection. Almost all families had repeat involvement, and 1 in 4 had a pattern of extreme involvement. But the families with the high levels of repeat involvement shared many characteristics, and that really helps us to target our prevention activities so that we can disrupt that intergenerational cycle. So the what? So case file review 1 and 2 demonstrate the importance of young and first-time parents. If we don't prevent that escalation, we're not going to disrupt the cycle. So we need to start with our kids. We know where they are. They're in care. They're in youth detention. They're visiting our child and adolescent mental health services. We need to try and reduce the rates of pregnancy for teens with maltreatment and trauma histories. We need interventions for young parents with trauma histories. They've got to be designed also around domestic and family violence and alcohol and other drug use. And we need to work with those teens who are parents to try and delay the birth of a subsequent child. For families with multiple children who are chronically involved with child protection, we need those high quality, intensive but not extended interventions aligned with the evidence base that are designed for clients experiencing a toxic trio again, which are culturally competent. And in terms of intergenerational trauma and abuse, we need to focus on the children as well in the families who are involved with child protection. They are our future, and we need to provide them the treatment and the support, and we need to listen to those kids we heard today who said, we needed the right help at the right time. But even if we get all that right, we don't solve this problem if we don't get the families into the right help at the right time. So we must reform the triage and assessment processes we have for child protection to move away from an incident-based system and to move to a system that is child and family centred, that actually looks at the characteristics of children and families and looks at ways that we can get them into the right help at the right time, rather than focusing on screened in, screened out today, and thinking that that's meaningful. So summing it up, and I've got 53 seconds, reporters calling child protection centres are reliable. 1 in 4 in South Australia. We think that's probably our best indicator of the incidence of child abuse and neglect. We think it really is 1 in 4, as much as we don't want to believe it. Child protection involvement is a story of chronic involvement, not just for children, but for families, and it's one of intergenerational and complex trauma. I feel like some of these things, once you say it, you kind of take the blinkers off. And of course, when I think about the families, when I think about the story that Judge Beecroft told us of that young man in youth justice, when we think about stolen generations and what our Aboriginal communities have been telling us about, giving them the power to start making a difference for their communities, it's not surprising, but we had missed the point. We'd been structuring our system and our services on the assumption that it was a first-generation problem and that people were going to incrementally move up a pyramid of complexity. So our current early intervention and prevention efforts are based on the wrong assumptions, and as we found in the desktop evaluations, we're not providing them well. But, I think... as I said, I have great hope. This is not a Pandora's box. We've not opened something and created something new. It was happening. This was a head in the sand issue. I feel like we're finally taking our head out of the sand. Once we can see the problem, we can create a clear... there is really, really clear directions for us to take in turning this around. This was happening for kids. It's happening for kids today, but we can turn this around. There are such clear prevention potential in what we've found. So I have a vision for the lives of children getting better in this country, and so I have great hope. Thank you.